Today's lesson is Swiss village buried as glacier collapses. Hi, everybody. I am Roger.
And I'm Mike.
And we're going to Switzerland in today's lesson. Oh, boy. I look forward to that because lots of people just love Switzerland. But we're not really going there to have fun. We're going there to talk about a tragedy that happened there recently. What? A tragedy in Switzerland? It's like the most perfect country in the world. But no, something bad happened there because a glacier collapsed there and buried a village there. That is very tragic.
It is absolutely tragic. You may remember this news from a few months ago. I think it happened. There was something else going on in the world. I'm not sure if it was a trade war story or something. It kind of faded into the background, but it was definitely a very dramatic event. And you might remember the pictures. I saw a lot of these sort of before and after pictures. They showed you the village before. This glacier sort of sent this avalanche of rock down onto the town. And it was a lovely little town kind of sitting in a valley right there in the Swiss Alps. All these cute little houses, a few farms on the outskirts. And then the next picture was just this muddy puddle, this huge mass of rock that had buried like 80-90% of the town. There's a few houses over here, a few over there, but most of the town had disappeared under this blanket of gray rock. The good thing is, as we will learn, that I don't think anyone died. So that's the good news. There was warning of this. Of course, avalanches and things like that are a rare occurrence in the Swiss Alps. The sad part is, this has a lot to do with global warming. So let's get into it, find out more about the Great Glacier and how it collapsed, burying a Swiss village. Swiss village buried as glacier collapses. A huge chunk of the Birch Glacier in the Swiss Alps collapsed on May 28th, sending an avalanche of rock and ice down on the small village of Blatten. By the time the landslide stopped, around 90% of the village had been destroyed.
大家好，第一部分介绍动词 collapse， 它的意思是崩塌或是倒塌。例如 The chair collapsed when I sat down on it. 当我坐在那张椅子上时，它就塌了。或者 The bridge over the river collapsed, leading to traffic disruptions. 那座跨河桥梁倒塌，导致交通中断。继续看到名词 chunk， 表示厚块、大块，也可以是大部分或是大量的意思。例如Ruben cut a few chunks of cheese to enjoy with some fruit slices. Ruben 切了几块乳酪和一些水果片一起享用。或是 Pass me a chunk of that chocolate bar. My sweet tooth is acting up today. 给我一大块那种巧克力棒，今天我的甜食欲发作了。
Okay, so let's focus on the title first before we get into the first part of our lesson for today. If something's from Switzerland, it is Swiss. Okay, lots of people save money so they can buy a Swiss watch, or of course, Swiss chocolate is kind of the best chocolate in the world to a lot of people. And a glacier, of course, is what you call an ice river in Chinese, and this glacier has collapsed. If something collapses, it falls down. It's usually something quite big, and it falls down suddenly and violently. If you run a marathon, for example, and you're just exhausted at the end of the race, you might collapse. You might pass out after you cross the finish line. And also a building could collapse in an earthquake. In this particular case, though, the glacier collapsed. It kind of fell down. A large part of it broke off and buried this Swiss village.
My gosh. All right. So we're going to learn all about that in our paragraph. So let's check out what exactly happened. It says a huge chunk of the Birch Glacier in the Swiss Alps collapsed on May 28th, sending an avalanche of rock and ice down on the small village of Blatten. All right, there you go. There's the basics of what we're talking about, this whole story. It's all summed up there. This was a huge chunk of a glacier. It's called the Birch Glacier. I guess glaciers, if they're there for a very long time, and especially if they're near human habitation, they'll be given names, just like lakes and rivers and mountains are given names. And this was a huge piece or chunk of something. So yeah, a chunk is a part that's been ripped or torn or broken off a larger mass. It could be something really large, like like a chunk of rock that might get broken off a mountain. When we had those earthquakes down near Hualien, of course, chunks of the Taroko Gorge were breaking off and blocking roads, and unfortunately some people were injured and killed by that. So a huge piece of something. I could also rip off a chunk of bread if I'm trying to just sort of share the bread. If we're dipping it in our soup, I'll just give you a chunk of bread. It's not a slice of bread. It's a sort of rough piece of the bread, and it's not measured or cut in any particularly careful way. It's broken or torn apart from a larger piece. So a chunk of rock, a chunk of ice, a chunk of bread, something that is ripped off and used on its own as a smaller amount. And it came crashing down from the Swiss Alps. It collapsed, this glacier, and it sent this avalanche of rock and ice down on the small village of Blatten. When we hear avalanche, we often think of ice, and we think of a massive sheet of ice that kind of comes loose on a mountain up high in the high altitudes where there's snow and ice on the side of the mountain. It comes loose maybe as the snows melt in the springtime, and it slides down like a massive sheet. We've seen this in action films. James Bond is often being chased by an avalanche in his many movies. But we can also use rock in the same way. So it's not a chunk. It's usually like many pieces of smaller rock. And it will, as I said, move as sort of a sheet or one mass. And it came sliding down onto this small village. The name of the village is Blatten.
Yeah, I tend to think an avalanche involves snow and a landslide involves dirt or rocks and things like that, but they can be interchangeable sometimes. And the landslide stopped, and by the time it stopped, 90% of the village had been destroyed. And fortunately, there wasn't a great loss of life in this. They were all evacuated. They knew what was going to happen, as we're going to find out as our lesson continues. So let's do that. Let's go on to the second part of our lesson, and we will listen first.
Although the village's 300 residents had been evacuated days before the disaster, they cannot now return, as their homes were destroyed or buried in mud. In fact, with other parts of the glacier still at risk of collapse, it remains unclear whether the villagers will ever be able to return to the area. Upon visiting the scene, the Swiss president, Karen Keller-Sutter, described it as apocalyptic, adding, "Nothing is visible anymore."
第二部分看到名词 resident， 它的意思是居民或是住户。例如 Gavin has been a resident of the city since he was a child. Gavin 从小就是这个城市的居民。也可以说 In a small town like this one, all of the residents know one another. 在这样的小镇里，所有居民都彼此认识。接着介绍名词 disaster， 表示灾难或是大祸。可以说The earthquake was a disaster that left thousands of people homeless. 这场地震是一个使数千人无家可归的灾难。又或者说 This latest news could spell disaster for the government. 这个最新消息对政府来说可能意味着灾难。
All right, we are back. So we're learning more about the Birch Glacier collapse and how an avalanche of rock and ice from that collapse of the glacier, where a large chunk came breaking off, it collapsed and it slid down onto the village of Blatten, burying the village. 90% of the village, we just learned, has been destroyed. It's gone. I don't know if they're planning to rebuild there or just move the people out because it's too dangerous a location, but most of the village is gone, or at least buried under millions of tons of rock and stone and possibly ice too. The good thing is, though, we get to that good news in the beginning of the second paragraph. Although the village's 300 residents had been evacuated days before the disaster, that's the good news, they cannot now return as their homes are destroyed or buried in mud. So yeah, good news, bad news situation. The good news is that the 300 residents, or people who live there, if you live in your home, you're a resident of that home, that house, that building, that apartment. If you live in a city, you are a resident of that city and country as well. As long as you live there, that is your home. That is the place you are registered, or where you get your mail or something like that. You're a resident of that place. They had been evacuated. They had been moved out of there for safety reasons. That's what happens when you evacuate something. There's a fire, get out of the building, evacuate the building. There's an earthquake, the building is damaged. We have to evacuate everyone. A big storm is coming or a war is coming. We might have to evacuate whole villages or towns because we don't want the people who are living there to be in danger, so get out, danger is coming, evacuate. They were evacuated days before this disaster. So I guess scientists had noticed large cracks in the glacier, maybe rocks had been falling, dropping off it more slowly. So they knew something bad was going to happen here. A disaster was about to happen, a very bad, calamitous, terrible event that could involve the loss of life or great damage to property or things like that. So a train crash, a plane crash, a boat sinking, an earthquake, a building collapsing, these are all disasters. But they knew the disaster was probably going to happen soon, so they got everyone out, they evacuated everyone. That's the good news, but they, residents, cannot now return. That is no longer their home. You can't go back to Blatten. Their homes are destroyed or buried in mud, and I suppose even going back for insurance documents or photographs or something, that's banned. It's probably just too dangerous. So basically, that is going to be a ghost town. People will not be living in Blatten in the future, and anything that is there will have to stay there. It's just too dangerous.
And because they were evacuated ahead of time, that implies that they knew it was going to happen, so the people probably had time to get those important documents or photo albums or their computer hard drives or whatever and get that stuff out of there. And those people essentially became refugees. Hopefully they were put up in other parts of Switzerland and they'll be given money to rebuild in other parts of the country. And in fact, with other parts of the glacier still at risk of collapse, it remains unclear whether the villagers will be able to return to the area. So they're looking at this glacier and they're thinking, well, you know, it could possibly collapse again. It's at risk of collapsing. If something is at risk, that means there is potential, a possibility of something happening there. So they're not really sure if more parts of the glacier are going to collapse. So they should probably stay out of there for the time being.
Yeah, definitely sounds like that is the case. And of course, rebuilding in that area would be very expensive and take a very long time, but very difficult for the people who formerly called Blatten their home. It says, upon visiting the scene, the Swiss president, Karen Keller-Sutter, described it as apocalyptic, adding nothing is visible anymore. So once the danger had passed, it's quite common for top politicians to visit a disaster area to kind of see what it's like and talk to the locals, see what help they can provide, what services or things that they need. So the president of Switzerland, she made a visit, and upon seeing it, she described it as apocalyptic. This is a great word, and it basically kind of means the end of the world, a massive disaster. So think of a city hit by a very large earthquake. Think of Hiroshima after the dropping of the atomic bomb, or, you know, those cities in Germany or in Japan after they had been bombed from the air for a very long time. And there's nothing there. There's no life. Everything is on fire or destroyed or burnt or in some state of falling apart. And it really does kind of look like a biblical scene, a disaster movie scene, kind of end of the world type situation. So she described it in those terms. There's really nothing here. This village is gone. And she added nothing is visible anymore. All you can see is sort of gray rock and mud and dirt that came down as this avalanche, this landslide down the side of the mountain. So there's really nothing there.
Yep, hopefully those people will be well taken care of in the future. That brings us to the end of the second part of our lesson for today. Let's finish things up now with the third part. We will listen first.
The village's destruction is just the latest in a string of events in the Alps that have been attributed to climate change. As permafrost warms and melts, mountains become unstable, which can lead to catastrophic landslides. Scientists note that the Alps are warming at about twice the global average, which is speeding up the collapse of previously stable alpine structures. With a rapidly warming planet, experts warn that this latest tragedy certainly won't be the last.
第三部分看到名词 destruction， 它的意思是破坏或是毁灭。例如 The storm left behind a trail of destruction， 该暴风雨留下一道破坏的痕迹。再看一个例子 The destruction caused by the tropical storm was reported internationally， 这场热带风暴造成的破坏被国际媒体报道。再来我们看到形容词 catastrophic， 指的是灾难性的或是引起重大灾难的。举例来说 The oil spill had a catastrophic effect on the environment. 这起漏油事件对环境造成灾难性的影响。又或者说 A catastrophic flood has destroyed the bridge. 一场灾难性的洪水摧毁了那座桥。 最后看到名词 tragedy， 它表示灾难、不幸，也同时可以是悲剧作品的意思。可以说 It is a tragedy that so many people were hurt in the accident. 有这么多人在事故中受伤，是一个悲剧。最后一个例子 We are studying Western tragedies in English class. 我们在英文课学习西洋悲剧。
Okay, so again, we're talking about the destruction of this village. It was buried by a glacier, or at least an avalanche that resulted from the collapse of a glacier here. So the 300 residents of that village were evacuated, and hopefully they're safe now. But again, the village has been destroyed. And here the village's destruction is just the latest in a string of events in the Alps that have been attributed to climate change. So destruction is when something is destroyed. If you destroy something, you basically make it a condition in which it doesn't exist anymore. Like Hiroshima was destroyed in World War II, for example, and this village was destroyed. It was completely covered by an avalanche, by a landslide. And it's part of a string of events. Okay, this is not an isolated event. It's been happening in other parts of the Alps as well. The Alps, of course, that's the mountain range in, what is it, Central Europe or something, in France, Switzerland, Austria, Germany, Italy, those places. They all have Alps mountains there. And yes, this has been blamed on climate change. If something's attributed to something, it's blamed on that thing. They basically have this as the explanation. This is happening because of climate change.
There you go. It can be attributed in a blame type way, but also maybe in a good way. You might attribute this work to a certain author, or if you have an idea in your company and someone says, oh, that was Bob's idea. It's being attributed to Bob. But yes, in this case, it's not good. Climate change is being blamed. It's being given the credit, the bad credit, for causing this string of events. There's sort of this cluster of things that have happened in the Alps recently, and a lot of them, or all of them, have been attributed or blamed on climate change. Why? It says, as permafrost warms and melts, mountains become unstable, which can lead to catastrophic landslides. The world is getting warmer, so the icy parts of the world are no longer icy, they're now just wet. So basically, permafrost is land that is in such a cold area that the dirt under the surface of the soil remains frozen all the time. We also call this tundra in some parts of the world. Most of Canada is permafrost or tundra. You can't really thaw out the earth. It's not very useful for farming because if you go down a few centimeters under the sort of warmer upper layer, the dirt layer, it just becomes icy dirt under there. So it's permanently frosted. In other words, it's permanently frozen. But as the world gets warmer, those areas of the world that have been like that for millions of years, they are getting warmer. That water under the surface is melting. And so now that dirt is becoming looser and things start to slide, things start to move, things start to happen. Mountains become unstable. They are no longer frozen. So yes, now those rocks can now slide downhill, and that can lead to catastrophic landslides. If something is catastrophic, it's pretty similar actually to apocalyptic. It's like a catastrophe. It's like a disaster. It's the type of thing you would see after one of those huge events happens, and there's a lot of destruction, there's a lot of damage, possibly a lot of death or something like that. So a big, terrible accident can often be described as catastrophic. If the landslide happens in the middle of the Himalayas when there's no one around, not necessarily catastrophic. If it happens near human settlements, near people and buildings and stuff, and it costs a lot of money or kills people, now it will be catastrophic.
And scientists note, or they indicate, that the Alps are warming at about twice the global average.
Wow.
For some reason, we don't really know why. It's not really told here, but the mountains in Europe there are getting warmer at twice the rate of other places in the world, and that is speeding up the collapse of previously stable alpine structures, like maybe even the Matterhorn someday will fall down, who knows. And in any case, yes, to speed something up just means to increase the speed. That's what a lot of people do if they see the light up ahead is turning yellow and it's going to turn red. Oh, I better speed up and get through that light. You can't really do that, though. That's very dangerous, so don't speed up to run the red light. But here, this is accelerating the collapse of these these alpine structures, it's making them collapse faster.
With a rapidly warming planet, experts warn that this latest tragedy certainly won't be the last. Yes, the world is not going to get cooler anytime soon. We don't really have a good plan to stop or slow the warming of the planet. So, as the planet gets warmer and more permafrost in areas like that start to get warm, this will happen again. It will happen again, as it says. This latest tragedy or disaster certainly won't be the last. A tragedy could be something really big, like a disaster, a train crash, or a plane crash. It can also just be a really, really sad thing. If a family loses their young baby, it might not affect anyone else in the world, but for them, it's a very sad, terrible, awful event. And there's really nothing very good out of it. So there's nothing very good about mountains collapsing and avalanches and things like that. And these bad things will continue to occur.
Indeed. Well, that brings us to the end of our discussion for today. Here comes Henny.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第一部分有一句写到 By the time the landslide stopped, around 90% of the village had been destroyed. 当山崩停止时，该村大约90%的区域已遭摧毁。那这边要介绍 by the time 的用法。by the time 引导时间副词子句，表示到点点点的时候，到什么什么时间之前。那么 by the time 主词加动词，这部分可以把它摆在主要子句之前或是之后，用来描述在那个时间点之前的状态或是已发生的事情。那它可以用来指过去或是未来的情况。我们在指过去情况时， by the time 引导的子句是用过去式，主要子句可以用过去简单式或者是用过去完成式 had 加 pp 来强调动作已经发生或完成，就像我们课文的句子。那 by the time 它引导的子句在这边用过去式动词 stopped， 那么主要子句是用过去完成式，而且是被动语态had been destroyed。 好，那我们也造一个例句。 By the time we got there, there were no more seats left. 我们到的时候已经没有空位了。那这边主要子句是用过去简单式表达。好，那么指未来情况时， by the time 引导的子句是用现在简单式，而主要子句可以用未来简单式 will 加原形动词，或者是用未来完成式 will have 加 pp 来强调动作预计将会完成。举例来说， By the time you come back, I will have finished my homework. 等到你回来时，我就已经写完回家作业了。所以这边主要子句就是用未来完成式 will have finished。 好，那么课文第二部分提到，该村的300名居民在灾难发生前数日就已经撤离了。文中用到名词 disaster， 它是指灾难大祸。那我们来学习它的字首字根。在古希腊文里面 astron 这部分表示复数的星星 the stars， 那么 aster 表示单数的星星 a star， 所以带有 astro 或者是 aster 这两个字根的字就会跟星星或是天体有关。好，那么在 disaster 这个字当中，字首 dis 表示分离或否定，字根 aster 表示星星。那以前占星学家认为天有异象时，人间必有灾难，那么 disaster 就是源自于这个说法，表示灾难灾祸。好，我们顺便补充2个有这一类字根的单字。第一个 astrology， 它的字根 astro 表示星星，那么字尾 logy 它表示学说。那跟星星有关的学说应该可以联想到 astrology， 它是指占星术、占星学。第二个补充 astronaut， 它的字根 astro 表示星星， naut 表示水手。那同学们可以试着联想，太空人就好像是坐着太空船的水手，在宇宙中航行冒险，所以 astronaut 就是太空人咯。好，那以上是今天重点整理，我们回顾今天的单字。
Collapse. An old building down the street from our apartment building collapsed during the earthquake. Chunk. Devin cut the meat into large chunks before putting it in the pot. Resident. Most of the residents of this neighborhood own their homes. Disaster. Weather forecasts suggest that the typhoon could be the worst natural disaster in years. Destruction. The ongoing war has led to the destruction of entire city blocks throughout the country's capital. Tragedy. The house fire was a terrible tragedy that killed 5 people.
Discussion starter starts now!
It's time now for our discussion starter. The question is, do you expect that residents of other Swiss villages in the Alps will need to be evacuated in the near future? Why or why not?
Yes, I think further evacuations are likely to be necessary because global warming will not slow down. The temperatures will continue to go up. I do have some faith that the clever Swiss engineers and authorities might find ways to protect more villages by taking certain actions, but I think other parts of the Swiss Alps might have to be abandoned just because they will simply be too dangerous to live in.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I don't expect residents of other Swiss villages to be evacuated in the near future because the Swiss are pretty smart and they've already thought this through. They know where the collapses are going to occur, and those people have long moved away. Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Roger.
I am Mike.
See you next time.